This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to our website about a couple of weeks after the webinar to give us time to do any editing that may be required in the meantime. So want to welcome everybody. Thank you for registering for this webinar. I'm trying to admit people while I'm saying things, which is why I'm confusing myself. But the way this will run is we will have our speaker get started here momentarily, and then I will administer a short poll while he is getting started. And then David Kay is with us from Cornell University. He is going to give us an overview of the COP process, what it's like having been an attendee. And then there will be another poll at the end of his presentation. And he has left time to answer any questions we might have. Everyone is currently muted, and I have turned off the ability to unmute because we do have a decent sized audience today. I hate for anybody to slip up and accidentally hit something, a key on a keyboard that would interrupt. But when we get, as we go through the presentation, feel free to enter questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And then at the end of the presentation, if you do have a question that you would like to verbally answer, we will accept hands raised, and I will unmute you personally if you'd like to go that route. So with that said, I think the logistics are out of the way, and I will go ahead and turn it over to David Kay, who I met personally as a fellow steering committee member for the National Extension Climate Initiative. So thank you, David, for agreeing to speak today, and I will turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just pull up some slides. And are things good, Hans, in terms of seeing this full slide?
Yep, the view looks good.
Okay, I'm not going to take the poll. So maybe I should just start with a little bit of introductions of myself beyond that I work with Hans as a steering committee member on the National Extension Climate Initiative. Also to say hello to a few people whose names, if not faces, I can see who are here, who I already know. And I'll start. So what I'll start with by way of introduction is I'm trained as an economist originally. I spent many years in a rural sociology and then development sociology department because it changed its name. And for the past few years, I transitioned with many other people into Cornell's newly created Department of Global Development. And I'm bringing that up in part because most of my career has been working with New York State local governments and communities, first as a member of Cornell's local government program, and then as a member of the Community and Regional Development Institute. This is all prior to joining Global Development. So there's a change, if you will, in the scope of what I've been working on that is part of what took me to Glasgow, which is, and the way I would frame it is I've always been interested, but I'm now sort of more formally interested in trying to think about how the local and the global in our very globalized world are related to each other. And as you'll see in my presentation, as I start into it, I'm still primarily interested in, and whatever expertise I may have is related to my career working with people at the local level. So a lot of this is somewhat the perspective of someone who's pretty new to, certainly never been to the COP before. I'll also mention, I'm going to give you a version of this talk that focuses more on the kinds of things you would see in the headlines coming out of this in terms of what was or was not accomplished at the COP26. I was there for the first week of that COP, but I also have a more, if you will, personalized set of annotated slides about my experiences there online, and that's what the URL down at the bottom is about. And I'm sure that Hans can share that with you guys later at some point, or you can email me with your questions if you just want access to that as well. dlk2@cornell.edu. So with that said, I'll move on to the presentation, assuming it advances. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start kind of not quite as autobiography, but a little more trying to give you a sense about what I was, why I was there and what I was doing there. And I will say that I'd thought probably for 4 or 5 years about going to a COP because I am very interested in climate issues, and had never really felt I had enough background or understood well enough what was going to happen there to be able to justify the travel, the time, the expense, the carbon footprint until this past year. But during this past year, I spent actually a couple of years, if you will, in a certain way, doing my homework about whether it'd be worthwhile to go. And a lot of what that involved was networking with people who had been or knew what was going on, both as individuals, other people at Cornell, but also with organizations. So in a specific sense, then I had made it possible for me to represent several organizations at the COP in various ways. So one of those was Cornell University. I went as a Cornell delegate with a badge that was issued to me because I am on the faculty at Cornell. I also went representing the city of Ithaca in certain specific ways because I have been a city official in the past. I was chair of the city planning board for a number of years. And I also went because of my affiliation with, which is really beyond my Cornell work, but somewhat associated with it. I'm a member of the Climate Change Project group within Mediators Beyond Borders International. So each of these organizations had a sort of formal, specific reason to go to the COP and participate in certain events there. Beyond that, I spent a fair amount of time trying to connect with organizations that I knew were doing work that was related to what I was interested in, primarily about the climate negotiations and the other things that happen at the COPs. So I have a list here of a number of those organizations with which I'd been able to network ahead of time. I'm going to point out a couple of them that are particularly important to me. I won't talk about them all, but firstly, I ended up deepening my relationship to Local Governments for Sustainability, fondly known as ICLEI. They actually programmed almost all of the programming at one of the large pavilions that were in Glasgow, and I spent a lot of time at that pavilion. I'll also mention that our university, I helped get our university involved with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network of organizations globally who are essentially academic or research institutions who are trying to monitor progress towards and accelerate progress towards all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, of which climate is one of them. Climate related one is one of them, but there are many other ones, but they definitely had a presence at the COP, and also the ACE, or Action for Climate Empowerment group. And I put United World Colleges up there because I'm alumni of that system, and they had over 60 ex-students. It's a high school actually, but they had over 60 ex-students who were attending the COP. So there were others, but these are kind of the key ones. Oh, the other one I wanted to mention was the RINGOs, which is essentially the research and independent NGOs, which have a formal status with the UN to be able to participate as more than observers in sort of an official way in some of the dialogue that goes on there. So one thing, and I really knew nothing about this, I would say 3 years ago, about what really happened at the COP and what it was like. But there are a variety of categories. I mentioned one, which is the RINGOs. There are a variety of categories of observer organizations. Some of them are very, what you would expect with a UN related meeting. The top 3 categories of UN agencies, specialized international agencies, and intergovernmental organizations at the national scale. But the one that I was really part of and was most able to connect to was the non-governmental organization groups, or NGOs. And most of my slides, by the way, I have URLs built into them that if you want a copy of the slide deck and you want more background information on what's in the slides, you can go to those links. So the UN has 9 formally organized and recognized NGO constituencies. I'm not going to go through them all here by any means, but they're rated, and they have cute names like bingos and ringos and engos and youngos. But I will point out, there's groups focused on everything from farmers to business to indigenous peoples. I've highlighted the 2 that I ended up spending the most time trying to interact with and learn about and be involved with. The one was the local government and municipal authorities group, and the other one, as I already mentioned, was the RINGO group. The function of these sort of formally organized groups is to, as it says down at the bottom, to facilitate the exchange of information between the UN Secretariat and the different categories of observer organizations. And most of these groups have meetings before, during, and after each of the COPs, which happen every year. And they are given, as I mentioned, they have to organize amongst themselves, essentially, who amongst their membership will be at various meetings, the opportunity to take the floor representing each of these groups in some of the formal negotiations or dialogues that are taking place. So again, I spent most of my time with the RINGO group, and some of my time increasingly as the week went on with the local government and municipal authorities group. This chart shows from COP number 1, 26 years ago or 27 years ago, the number of organizations in different categories that participate. And what you can see here is a literal explosion of participation in this. And this is related essentially to a pretty much of a change in the fundamental nature of what happens at these COPs. They were, and will continue to be a forum where formal negotiations take place between what's called the parties, the signatories to the agreement, who are nation states. But what's happened is the explosion has been in the number of participants who are not nation states, but are representatives of nation states, or sort of formal diplomatic groups that have that kind of status, but of all of the other kinds of organizations that I went through, the 9 other kinds of observer organizations. So I was given the estimate, for example, in Glasgow, that the population of the city grew by over 30,000 people who were either attending the meeting directly or involved in events that were organized in parallel to the formal meetings. This just gives you a little bit more of a sense of who's there, and what you'll see is the vast majority of people who go there are affiliated with the RINGOs, the Research and Independent NGOs, the NGOs, which are the environmental organizations, and the BINGOs, which are the business organizations. So and there's a lot of other people in other categories. Farmers make up a relatively small percent by number of the total participants, but we'll talk a little more about ag in a later slide. So I'm going to kind of shift now to talking about what you could think of as the kinds of things that if you were to read summary articles in the press, what happened, or to dig into it, what happened at the COP and why was it significant? To a significant degree, I'm going to base my remarks on some Ecaps, some recaps that have come out of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, which is actually provides information and targets information to in a nonpartisan way to Congress. But it is in general a pretty good source of information that comes from people who know a lot more about this process than I do. And again, there's a link if you want to. I would highly encourage anybody who's very interested in this to go and listen to some of their online information about this, because it's really quite succinct and I believe on target. One of the things which actually helped justify to myself that I was there was the recognition and acknowledgement that this particular COP, and maybe since the Paris Accord, which happened in 2015, there has been a shift, a significant shift in the nature of what's happening at the COPs. So this quote, which I'll just read, is one of the most careful ways of trying to frame what a lot of people see happening. So for many years, countries have worked under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process to create an international rule-based system for managing climate change. Now that we have that in the Paris Agreement, the nature of COP, Conference of the Parties is what that stands for, if I didn't say that already. The nature of COP is changing from a rule-making body to one that is more interested in implementation. What we are seeing at COP26 is the growing pains of a process that is attempting to adapt itself to the reality of the ambition gap, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and a new global regime under the Paris Agreement. So with that, what I really want to point to here is what this really is pointing to is the idea that the basic global structure of agreements between countries, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but the framework is in place after Paris. So they're starting to shift more towards talking about how do we make these things that happen, which are mostly high-level commitments to move in the right direction. How do we actually make them happen in the real world? To me, that's a signal, which I'll talk about more later as well, that we've moved beyond nation state to nation state negotiations, and even in these global agreements, to paying more and more attention to what is happening at the subnational level, as well as at the national level, unless at the international level, or less exclusively at the international level. So what's this kind of like basic idea of a gap all about? If you look at the black line on this chart, and most people who pay attention to this will be familiar with this, but the black line is the historical increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The dotted green line shows essentially what we need to do as a world in order to stay aligned with the 1.5 degrees centigrade agreement that was set as the target in the Paris agreements. And then that sort of blue band up there shows where we essentially are based on the pledges and targets that countries have set for themselves so far. So what you see here is a huge gap between where the world essentially has agreed we need to go and where we are, even in terms of just pledges. Enormous gap. Here's another way to sort of look at what's probably a kind of bottom line indicator of where we were going, where we are, where we need to go. So before Paris, we were what this chart is essentially saying, before Paris, we were headed for probably at least a 3.5 degrees centigrade warming, so 2 degrees centigrade higher than we have committed to as a globe. Every country basically is committed to that in one way or another. Pretty scientific community pretty much agrees that will be a very, very difficult world for us all to live in. Based on the 2030 commitments of nation states, which are labeled nationally determined contributions, if they were all followed through on, they would have been 2.6 degrees of warming, and they have some confidence intervals around us by 2020. Before the COP meeting, which just happened, we had reduced that to 2.4 degrees because of additional commitments. And after COP, there was a small incremental addition to that, down to 2.3 degrees centigrade warming. If you include various other kinds of promises and commitments by 2030 that go beyond sort of the formal commitments in the nationally determined contributions, things look a little better, down to 2.0 before COP26 and down to 1.8 as a result of COP26. Again, these are commitments, not realities, but they are commitments on the table that have followed through, science says would take us to these levels of warming. So a little more about what actually happened there. Let's see if I can move this. Okay. So there were a bunch of topics which were at the center of attention during the 2 weeks of the meeting. At the bottom there, you'll see this idea of completing the Paris Rulebook. This is what I referred to earlier as kind of the framework that for what countries need to do. There were still quite a few, even though the framework was basically put in place in 2015, there were still some important aspects of rules. A lot of this has to do with how do you account for, and hold accountable countries for making progress towards their greenhouse gas goals. Because it's not like it's always crystal clear or agreed upon what counts as a reduction in GHG emissions and what doesn't. There's a lot of subtlety and negotiation that happens around that. The second thing is the idea of the Paris ratchet and the existing pledges. So this is the basic idea that there's no backsliding. Formally allowed people have pledged, people meaning countries have formally pledged to a ratchet concept, which means every year to some degree, and certainly every large meeting, they're going to increase their pledges and their ambitions towards a more aggressive reduction of greenhouse gases. And then something that was unexpected beforehand, but came out of really the Scottish government's leadership, was there was a Glasgow Climate Pact, which came out of these meetings that wasn't really formally on the agenda to begin with. So I'll just kind of go a little bit more into each of those, hoping not to take too much time. And by the way, I can't see my clock, Hans, so at some point you might want to give me a heads up if I'm taking too much time, okay?
We're at 125 right now. You've got plenty of time.
Okay, thank you. So this idea of the pledges and the ratchet. So 151 countries at this meeting updated their nationally determined contributions. So insofar as they upgraded their commitments or accelerated their commitments, that's 151 countries that are, if you will, following the rules that they pledged to about what they were supposed to do at every meeting, which is to up the ante, to accelerate progress. There was some progress on the coal issue, which was a major issue there, particularly from the 4 countries that are named, making new commitments, ratcheting up their commitments to deal with things. There was a new declaration that came out with relationship to deforestation, and there was a new pledge about reducing methane, which came out, which was signed by many folks. I'll talk about those each a little bit more. I think I already mentioned the basic Glasgow climate Pact that came out of this that was not really anticipated, which is, again, mostly about trying to accelerate progress. There were some disappointments for many people about some of the language used regarding coal. This reference here to loss and damage finance is a very, very important part of the negotiations, which has to do with who is going to be responsible for historical contributions in particular and current losses and damages because of the climate changes, which are already in evidence around the world and causing damage. The island nations in particular, which are an organized group, are particularly concerned about this, but many, many other countries are. And to some extent, it's a question of the countries that are, how much are the countries that are wealthier and more developed and have been emitting greenhouse gases at a high level for a very long time, what's their role in providing financing for trying to deal with this problem. In terms of the rulebook issue, there's another, which is the idea of the sort of the broad framework that was put in place in Paris. This quote down here at the bottom emphasizes, it's many people think of this as a weakness of the framework, but it's sort of the way the world really is, which is that there are no penalties in the climate regime. There's only naming and shaming, to quote this negotiator. In other words, this is about commitments and following through on commitments. There's no global police that are going to come along and say, hey, you know what? If you didn't follow through on your commitments, there's a built-in obvious penalty. You're not going to go to jail for that. So in that context, with this negotiator, the point they're making is if the only really power you have associated with these agreements is that you've made a public promise to the world about your intended behavior, then it's very important to have a transparent system which enables people to see, besides your claims, whether or not progress is actually being made. I think I covered all of this already. And again, I'm not an expert in any of these particular areas, but I do have material I could direct you to that would give you a lot more background. I think I talked about the function of the ratchet already. This summarizes that. I talked about these countries in particular, recognizing the need to phase down coal. There was actually a lot of headlines, which I'll mention later, came out about that terminology, phase down. Some people wanted stronger language. Here's the one about the forest and land use question and the forest and agricultural commodity trade dialogue. Again, I have a lot of background material for this, but I'm not deeply steeped in most of these myself. Here's one that I have been paying more attention to myself, partly because Cornell has been, some of my colleagues at Cornell have been very involved in some of the global debates about, from a scientific perspective, about whether or not how bad methane really is, particularly in comparison to coal. And they haven't all agreed about that within my own institution. So, which is an extension professional, is an interesting thing to manage in an area where I'm not expert, but have spent a fair amount of time trying to inform myself about the different perspectives. So, and I also mentioned the Glasgow Climate Pact and the transparency issue. So that gets me through a whole bunch of slides quickly. So here is a little more about the importance of transparency. I just want to emphasize again that part of what happens each year at these international meetings and other meetings, not just the COP, is that each country essentially is responsible for reporting out to some degree the progress they've made towards their goals. So this is literally a place where, to some degree, accountability takes place in a formal setting for making progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's also this whole thing about Article 6 was another major topic area, which has to do, particularly for the economists who might be among you, is pretty much focused on accounting rules on the one hand and the use of carbon markets in order to try and make progress towards the greenhouse goals, and how important it is, again, to have rules that people agree on. If you're going to use markets, you have to agree sort of on the units of analysis, and in particular, making sure that countries don't get credit for things in ways that count their whatever they're trying to do twice in the same accounting framework. So I'm in an ag college, so I have particular interest in land use and agricultural questions, and there is a whole parallel discussion part of this whole negotiation that's been going since 2017 on agricultural issues, called the Cornell Joint Work on Agriculture. It covers a lot of topics, which shouldn't be surprising, but you might want to just take a look at what's listed here, ranging from the sort of soil science side of things into the all the way up to the socioeconomic and food security dimensions of what's going on under this label of agriculture. These are the kind of themes. I'm not going to get into the sub bullets here in this presentation, but this is really a summary of what the issues that the Cornell dialogues are grappling with. The first one's a little bit abstract. It's essentially about how are we going to do what we're going to do and who plays a role. Notice farmers, youth, local communities, indigenous peoples being called out in this particular bullet. How do we assess adaptation? There's a pretty heavy, particularly in agriculture, as you can imagine, there's a pretty heavy emphasis on the adaptation side of what's going on with climate change, not simply the mitigation side, which a lot of people associate the COP with more. So given that climate change is already happening in the world, how are we going to live in this world? And how is agriculture going to continue to be productive in this changing world? Carbon health, soil fertility, improve nutrient use and manure management, improve livestock management systems, socioeconomic and food security dimensions. And you can see under these bullets the kinds of things that they talk about. I will say that one of my colleagues who has been from Cornell, who's been to the COP many times at this point, is a member of the Armenian delegation that deals with agriculture in the Koronovia dialogue. And she says that's probably one of the well, I don't know if she's totally serious, but at least as a partial truth, partial joke, she says one of the most boring ways that you can attend the COP is being part of a formal delegation, because even though it's very important, you spend most of your time talking about the meaning of phrases such as the ones you're seeing here. Going to do a little shift now, kind of more to sort of my own experience. Briefly, excuse me. So if you saw the press, and I experienced this while I was there was very much of a glass half empty, glass half full kind of dichotomy in experiencing this. So let's start with the glass half empty piece. This picture is of Alok Sharma, who was the president of he basically presided over the whole meeting. He was the president of the COP. So there was a point near the end where he was literally on the verge of tears with distress about some unexpected changes in the words that discussed how this global community would talk about phasing out versus phasing down. I believe the language was coal, and there had been a belief that people would agree on phasing out coal. It was replaced because of India's intervention with phasing down. So many people highlighted this as kind of a low point, and he was emotional about this, and apologized to everybody that they hadn't been able to get the more aggressive wording in place. Excuse me. At the other end of the spectrum, here's John Kerry from the United States, the sort of official climate envoy for the United States, talking in Paris a couple days after the end of the conference. So he says he is a little bit shocked. This is the glass half full. He's a little bit shocked at the negative downer media reports about the Glasgow meeting's outcomes. He called them sort of cataclysmic perspectives, basically coming from people who didn't understand how international negotiations like the COP worked. And so he was vastly more positive than the critics. And if you've watched the press on this topic at all, it's very easy to find people who are on both sides of this. I'm not enough of an expert in this area to really have anything other than my own very mildly informed opinions about whether it was a disaster or a success as a meeting, but I am close enough to it to see that people are looking at the same facts from different perspectives, and they don't really disagree on the underlying facts very much, but they interpret them very differently. And I will also say that in my observation, the activist community sees, in general, sees the glass as being half empty, and the people who are insiders to negotiations see that enormous progress was actually made. That's kind of my read of who's saying what. So my own focus at the negotiations, as I started earlier, given my background, was on not on international negotiations, but what happens at national, state, and local levels, and to use US terminology. And here is, this is something I was tuning into a lot. So the local government and municipal authorities constituency, which I mentioned, has a formal status at the COPs. It's recognized as one of the formal constituencies. It has a roadmap that it has put out. And amongst, you can see in yellow, the sort of 4 key theme areas within that roadmap. And I want to draw your attention to the word multi-level, because multi-level is UN speak for starting to pay more attention to what happens at the local, state, and national, not just the global level. So what they're saying here is they want to see multi-level action as the new normal for moving ahead. You can look at the other topics there as well. And the actual accord I mentioned, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was not initially planned as coming out of this meeting, but did come out of it as an unexpected positive agreement. It's one of the reasons that people like John Kerry are happy with what happened. As you can see in this quote from that preamble to that agreement, it actually recognizes, amongst a bunch of other things that are important, I'm highlighting here the urgent need for multi-level and cooperative action. So in this world where words matter a lot to the participants, the prominent naming of multi-level is one of the things that people are taking, signaling a turn in a new direction. I will just mention that, you know, a lot of people have been thinking about this idea for a long time. And this is a bunch of organizations you can see listed at the bottom of this slide, which actually have put together a variety of guiding principles for, this is on the adaptation side, which is only half of the picture because there's also the mitigation side, but looking at locally led adaptation initiatives and policies. I also want to draw attention to another formally constituted body, which many of us in Extension are going to be particularly interested in, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment framework and organizational efforts, because this is about education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation on climate. So these elements are a big part of what those of us in the educational community are most interested and capable of picking up and getting involved in. And there is a formal effort under this ACE label to figure out how to do this on a global scale. I think I'm gonna end here and open up for conversation. This is just a photo of us, the delegation from Cornell, and one person we met who were sort of trying to debrief on what's happening. We were also fortunate enough to have somebody who was essentially he's with our Atkinson Center for Sustainability, and he's essentially a media person. So he was able to help us craft our messages, get them back out to certainly back to Cornell and student audiences, but to some degree to other audiences. So I think I can take questions if there are any, Hans, and I still don't know what time it is, but.
Certainly, it's 1:45, so we've got plenty of time for questions. If you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to ask this first question we've got in the chat, and then I'll start the next poll. Barbara's asking, you mentioned, I think it was the local government group had a 4-point roadmap. Does that roadmap include specific project ideas or strategy that the multi-level groups can start doing?
So the answer to that is yes. I could not cite all of them for you off the top of my head, but I could provide you with resources to look more up about those things. I will say that the multi-level groups, just to be clear about what that means, and I assume that this is what Barbara means with that, is that are there things that could be done at all levels of government, of governance, I'll even say, ranging from the level of sort of the community and neighborhood level, which doesn't necessarily have formal government, on up to national governments. which is really what this is about, because that's the, if you will, the foundation upon which the ability to implement the nationally agreed upon goals have to be carried out, generally speaking. And, you know, the ACE group, and the LGMA group and ICLEI, there are actually a lot of organizations, including us in the National Extension Climate Initiative, which are working, trying to turn some of these ideas into, you know, more practical suggestions that are tailored to different levels of government and governance.
Okay, we've got another question in the chat. Do you have any suggestions for us as we reach out to our state and local governments?
Sure. Well, I think that here's one that comes up a lot. So in our NECI discussions, because of the diversity of places around the United States, and that is like, how do you engage with people on these issues? So I am not convinced personally that talking about Conference of the Parties, which happens once a year with global initiatives, is the right way to talk to everybody, to start a conversation with everybody that cares about these things. In fact, I'm pretty convinced, while it might be the right thing to bring up in some contexts, it's not the right way to start with most of the people I interact with. I want to start with what they care about. So for example, in my context, I spend most of my time working on my funded research projects and outreach projects. I work on personally on flood risk and flood insurance. And I work on siting issues related to large scale solar facilities, which are have come out of nowhere in New York State to be a major initiative that is raising all kinds of questions about things like the compatibility of solar and agriculture and the possibility of agrivoltaics and things like that. So it's very easy for me to engage in those conversations and then to decide, if you will, when is it appropriate for me to bring in the Conference of the Parties framework into those dialogues and when isn't it? So I don't know whether that addresses, you know, but as someone who's spent most of my career sort of thinking about community development, I would say the rule 1A about trying to engage with audience is listen first what they care about and try and, you know, be responsive to what their issues are as you're bringing in your perspectives on things. Again, I don't know if that's really what you were going for, but that's what came to my mind.
Well, thank you, David. Okay, thanks for putting your information in the chat as well. I have one question kind of personally that I've been mulling over that I know you probably can't answer scientifically, but may have an opinion on. You had mentioned the KJWA and the work in agriculture, and I noticed looking through your slides, actually your pictures in your slide Google site, that agriculture pops up multiple times in various places, and yet the farmer NGO organization only carried 1.2% of the delegation, right? The participants. Why do you think that farmers and agriculture aren't turning out people to the Conference of the Parties?
Well, I'm not sure that's a fair conclusion. I mean, just think about the United States. I mean, it's certainly true in terms of numbers, but I'm not sure it's true in terms of influence there. And, you know, think about the United States. What percentage of the US population is farmers as opposed to, let's say, people who identify as environmentalists and are members of environmental organizations. It varies from state to state, but overall, it's pretty tiny percentage of the total population. Now, obviously, it's a lot bigger in other countries. But all I'm trying to say is, to some extent, this is a those numbers are representative of who has lots of organizations representing their interests, and I can guarantee you that there are some very well-connected agricultural interests from all countries that are tied into these negotiations. And I'm not saying that they have ability to dominate the outcomes, but they're certainly heard.
I love being corrected and think that's a fair and true answer. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Raise your hand or put it in the chat. We'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds.
I might just add that, just as maybe my last comment, if there are no more questions, that, I'm not 100% sure. I went there as kind of as someone who was trying to explore the extent to which this sort of global meeting had relevance to the work I do. I was not committed to one way or the other. I wanted to find that out. I would say that much of the work that I do, I definitely do not need to know what goes on at the COP. So, I would not recommend that most of us and most of our day-to-day work need to stay fully apprised of this. However, I would say that at least for my work, I found that understanding what happens there and particularly this idea that there's kind of this shift that's going to make the kind of work that I do more and more relevant in the future within these global frameworks. It's something that made a difference to how I think about doing my work in the future. And it also is just a reinforcement for me that even though I work at the local level, there is, most of the issues that I deal with at the local level are influenced by global trends that are being discussed at these kinds of meetings. So it's not a bad idea to at least be broadly aware of them.
We did have one last question. Nancy is asking if you knew what the farmer organizations from the US might have been.
No, but I'm sure, I don't know that off the top of my head, but I could get that to you, Nancy, if it's the Nancy I know in particular.
Okay, I did just a moment's research, and we do know that the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, the organizations like National Farmers Union, American Farm Bureau Federation, and others involved in that were at the meeting. But
yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, well, we're approaching the end of the hour. We appreciate everybody for sticking around to this point. Thank you, David, for your presentation. Very excellent information for all of us. I can tell you, because I finally worked ahead, that the next North Central Climate Collaborative webinar will be on April 25th at 1 p.m. Central, and our speaker will be Kirsten Wise with the Crop Protection Network, discussing integrated pest management in a changing climate. So registration information for that will come out in the next couple of weeks. Hope we can see many of you there for that.